Welcome to Tvbs Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, we're pleased to have one of the world's most influential voices on China, the Honorable Kevin Rudd,陆克文. Kevin's a former Prime Minister of Australia and a former diplomat to Beijing. He studied Mandarin Chinese at Shifan Daxue in Taiwan. He's currently the global president of the Asia Society and author of The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China. Its Chinese version, 可避免的战争，美国与习近平治理下的中国, has just been published by 天下文化 in Taiwan. It's available online and bookstores. Welcome, Kevin.
Good to be with you. It's good to see the Chinese edition of The Avoidable War, 可避免的战争. So thank you very much for the free publicity.
Of course. And of course, throughout the interview, we know how good your Chinese is. So feel free to speak in Chinese whenever you feel comfortable. The Avoidable War is a culmination of your lifelong thinking and work on China. No other Western leaders have had this level of fluency of Chinese as a language and knowledge as a country. Your interest in China started at the age of 14 in 1971 when the People's Republic of China became a member of the United Nations, replacing the Republic of China, that is today's Taiwan. So tell our audience why you wrote this book, what you hope to tell the readers, and especially those in Taiwan.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to all of our friends in Taiwan. As you just mentioned, I spent part of my Chinese language education in Taiwan at Taiwan Shifan 国际大学的国语中心. And so the teachers there were great. They were very patient with a humble Australian student from the Australian countryside. And
I'm sure they're very proud. They're very proud of you.
Just the son of a farmer trying to learn something about the world. And so I remember Taiwan with great affection, and I visited Taiwan many, many times over the years and have friends on both sides of Taiwanese politics, both in the Kuomintang and the Minjindang, and of course in Taiwanese business and society. The reason I wrote this book was because for the first time in my 35 years of paying very close attention to the US-China relationship, I began to form the view that this relationship was beginning to get out of control, and the prospect of armed conflict between the US and China over Taiwan or over other scenarios had begun to become very real. And for those reasons, I needed to put on paper ways in which I thought we could avoid what would be a catastrophic war for China, for the United States, and for Taiwan, and frankly, for the entire world. So that gave rise to this book entitled 可避免的战争.
Well, you use the word out of control to describe what is going on between US and China now. And in your book, you also outline 10 scenarios of the US-China relationship in the so-called decade of living dangerously. And among them, 5 are actually about a possible US-China conflict over Taiwan. What are some of these scenarios, and which one is most likely to happen? Which one is the best for Taiwan from your point of view?
Well, my lifelong view of Taiwan, for whom I have a great affection, you've managed to transform yourselves into a vibrant local democracy, a vibrant economy producing the world's most advanced semiconductors, and an open society where you've got enormous freedoms, personal, social, etc. So my overriding philosophy and principle with Taiwan is, how do we preserve the status quo? How do we 保护现状? Because that is the best guarantee for China's long-term future.
Status quo, I think, is something that, you know, a lot of people would like to see, especially in the US and probably some in Taiwan. But as you said in your book, that may not be what Beijing wants to see ultimately. And from, you know, the Xi Jinping's speech last few days ago, we still see that unification or reunification, however you say it, is their ultimate goal. Is that possible to maintain status quo?
Well, you're right to say that the Beijing does not want to 保护现状. They have a completely different strategy and a very different philosophy on this ever since 1949, and since the Kuomintang went to Taiwan and established the government of 中华民国. So we understand very clearly at an analytical level the objective of trying to maintain the status quo, the fact that China does not want the status quo because it wants to achieve reunification with Taiwan by either peaceful or non-peaceful means. And that secondly, the United States and other countries would like to do whatever they can to sustain the status quo. So this leads to a real set of real-world strategic options and scenarios. Either one, what you do is to avoid war by accident, and what I call this decade of living dangerously in the 20年代, this period that we're in at the moment. Or secondly, when we get to the 2030s, which is when I think Xi Jinping would like to return Taiwan to Chinese national sovereignty, and if necessary by armed force, what we can do in the meantime to build US, Taiwanese, and allied deterrence to ensure or to increase the possibility that China would be deterred from taking Taiwan. These are the two elements: avoiding war by accident this decade and deterring war by design next decade. These are the two central arguments of the book that I've written.
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about if Beijing has a timetable, and you personally think in the 2030s is more likely. Why? Is it because they're still modernizing the PLA? What are they waiting for?
实在来讲是这样子，那个中共他们特别喜欢恢复台湾，但是他们对于台湾有一些考虑。第一就是那个军事方面的势力平衡，现在从他们的看法来讲不理想，他们还有许多的缺点，因此等到时间，等到那个军事那个现代化的最后的阶段，我认为不就是5年，大概是30年代最后结束了。到了那个时候，我认为他们的目标就是得到一个全面性的那个军事方面的好处。第二方面是什么呢？是财政方面的那个财务方面的，以及那个经济方面的措施。如果他们现在打仗的话，恐怕他们受到的那个全世界方面的财务以及经济方面的反应很厉害。与此同时，也能够破坏那个中国大陆的经济。因此，在这种情况之下，从他们的看法来讲，最好的就是等到30年代。到了那个时候呢，他们的估计就是他们能够得到一种那个财务经济方面的独立，不依靠那个全世界的那个经济财务方面的接触。到了这个时候呢，他们都认为这些情况，这些战略性的情况比现在更好。
That's first impressive Chinese. Second, two arguments that I have drawn from what you just said. Now, coming to domestic economic situation, since you have argued that that's really important for China, to wait until in the 30s, wanting to be independent. The zero COVID policy, Xi announced that he will continue for China, was somewhat of a surprise to a lot of people, especially I would say for a lot of investors. How is that going to continue to affect China's economy?
I think when we talk about the Chinese economy, there are many negative factors, or what we describe as negative headwinds against the Chinese economy right now. One is demography. population peaking. Next year, India will have a bigger population than China. First time in history. Birth rate low, aging population, an enormous burden, therefore, on the Chinese budget and on consumption. Number two is the impact of ideology. 习近平式的马列主义直接影响到那个国内经济的那个成绩。So the private economy in China is suffering a crisis of business confidence, and therefore their private fixed capital investment numbers are declining. So too is China's productivity growth. I think the third factor is COVID, which you've just referred to, and I'll come back to. And the fourth is 国内的那个地缘政治的情况，以及那个通货膨胀方面的挑战，以及那个国际性的那个利率方面的调整。So if you put all those factors together, that's what's bearing down on the Chinese economy. A big factor, one of four, 1/4, 就是那个疫情方面的政策。So my personal view is that while the 20th Party Congress report does not directly admit the possibility of change on COVID strategy, in fact, it defends the existing zero COVID strategy. If you look carefully at what's happening in Hong Kong at present for the last month, Hong Kong is already implementing a different COVID strategy, what they call individual medical supervision strategy, as opposed to locking down suburbs and cities. Don't be surprised if China then begins to trial this sort of new Hong Kong model on COVID management, starting from November, December in various cities in Guangdong. And if that succeeds, then elsewhere in China. So look at the Hong Kong model on COVID management, and in 12 months' time, imagine that as possibly being applied more generically across China itself. China knows this is bad for the economy. It's bad for social cohesion and social support for the Communist Party. And despite proclaiming victory over COVID in the 20大的那个工作报告, if you go to the 具体的业务呢，到了明年，我认为肯定有变化。
So it sounds like being very cautious and prudent is the approach that Beijing is taking, even though the rest of the world is really waiting anxiously for China to reopen. Now, China's economy obviously has been fueling the world's economic growth over the last, I would say, at least 2 decades or so. But more recently, as you have noted in your book, the economic conflict between US-China in some way has been a big worry to a lot of people. And Biden administration 2 weeks ago announced sweeping new export controls that some say will hobble China's chip industry. It's also been called Taiwan's Silicon Shield. So from Trump's trade war to Biden's technology war, US and China are in effect in an era of economic conflict. So how do you think about this? How will China retaliate? And another follow-on question, if I may, do you think the US still sees China as a competitor, as it claims, or is it really adversary or even enemy? Maybe a better sort of characterization of this relationship now.
So let's take the questions in reverse order. Let me deal with US-China as competitors or adversaries or enemies, and then go to the chips question after that. 把两个问题都放过来，好吧？ So the first one is, if we look at 是竞争者或者对手或者敌人。那个两个意义不就是在英文，而且在中文是有不同的意义，对不对？不同的意思。
是的。
So I think 我想实在来讲，现在按照那个客观的因素来分析一下，他们的关系是竞争者，战略性的竞争者。当然，老美他们直接 利用这个词汇来描写他们的双边关系，对不对？与此同时，那个中国共产党以及那个中华人民共和国，他们拒绝利用这个词汇，那个战略竞争者来描写他们双方关系，因为这个说法都破坏了那个习近平先生以前所提出的那个旗帜语，那个他的说法，他的提法，关于那个中美关系。没有那个对峙，没有那个冲突，那个互相理解、互相尊敬以及双赢，那就是他的。
但是美国现在好像不是用那样的方式来对待中国，对吧？
这个我完全理解，所以他们的框架是不同的。但是除了那个理论上的框架之外，那个具体内容是什么呢？他们已经变成那个竞争者，为什么呢？中华人民共和国他们的长期的那个历史性的使命是什么？变成那个全地区、全世界第一国，第一把手，那就是那个中华民族伟大复兴的那个具体的内容就是这样子，对不对？那就是习大大的那个政治方面的口号，对不对？当然，那个老梅他们不就是不赞成，而且全面反对这个口号以及那个使命。因此，从2017年之后呢，他们做出了一个战略性的决定，直接反对那个使命。到过了5年，已经得到了那个民主党派的支持。现在是2个党派的共同的使命，就是利用那个战略性的竞争者的那个关系，来执行一个全面性的战略、全面性的那个政策，来反对中国的那个全世界的那个使命，那是现实。挑战在于我们应该用什么样的方式，首先避免战争，而且对于台湾的前途来讲，保护现状。从我老陆的看法来讲，我唯一一个所感兴趣的2件事，就是这两件事，避免战争以及保护台湾的现状。
那台湾的这个 Silicon Shield， as I mentioned, the way, being viewed sort of the U.S. protection of Taiwan's Silicon Shield. How do you view that? Is that an act of protection or more of an act of attack almost on China's chip industry?
Well, often in Western political thought, we often say it's one thing or the other. The great contribution of Chinese historical political thought is that it can be all things at the same time. And so, and that is the truth. There is a bit of yin yang about this. So that number one, of course, Taiwan is enormously successful with advanced chip technology. TSMC is now a worldwide phenomenon. The fact that you've got TSMC producing microchips at 3 nanometers is a remarkable achievement for a little country like Taiwan, which I remember visiting and living in as an undergraduate student 30 or 40 years ago. The fact that you're now the world's leading semiconductor manufacturers is a tribute to TSMC and a tribute to the economic ecosystem which has made that possible. Secondly, obviously, the Americans are focused on this reality. They know that microchips lie at the core of military applications, civilian applications, and the future of productivity growth and the future of productivity growth for the United States. They understand that, which is why, of course, the Americans, both with TSMC and with Samsung and with other chip manufacturers, have insisted on a level of reshoring to the United States or nearshoring to the United States in order to ensure that they have long-term chip supply security. I think thirdly, however, to assume that the American interest in defending Taiwan rests entirely on semiconductors, so-called silicon shield, I think that's 75%以上的胡说八道. The American political class and their view, I live in the United States now, I work with Democrats and Republicans, I head the Asia Society, it's an American think tank. We deal with the US the whole time. Our view, in my view of their view, that's the Americans' view of Taiwan, is that it's much broader and deeper. It's because you've become a democracy, it's because you've become an open society, and because you've become a dynamic economy. It's a much wider equation. And as for TSMC representing a casus belli, or a reason for China to attack Taiwan, to seize TSMC, and the reason being that anyone who knows anything about the microchip business knows that this is quickly and immediately transferable to other locations. The foundry and the fab does not have to be in Taiwan. It's there for local reasons, which I understand and respect, but it's very quickly relocatable. So I neither think it's the exclusive reason or even the dominant reason for the United States' interest in Taiwan, nor do I think it's a dominant reason for China's efforts to retake Taiwan. Again, that's a much broader equation beyond microchips.
Well, I appreciate your analysis of Taiwan's strategic importance that goes beyond the Silicon Shield concept. And we can see that from the other military alliances that are increasingly paying attention to Taiwan as well. From Quad to AUKUS to even NATO, Taiwan is on everyone's mind. Do you think these military alliances will get involved if China invades Taiwan?
Well, you're right to say that in every capital in the world today, people are talking about Taiwan in a way I do not remember being relevant when I was a student in Taiwan in the early 80s. Because Taiwan back then was a military dictatorship. It had not written itself into the hearts of the democratic world, either in Asia or for that matter in the rest of the world. On the question of the level of allied engagement on the Taiwan question, of course, there are different forms of potential engagement. One is military. The second is financial and forms of potential engagement. One is military. The second is financial and economic. I think it's fair to say that those debates continue within the capitals of the democratic world. No leader of an American ally, either in Asia or for that matter in Europe, is going to commit to a particular formula of military action over a future Taiwan scenario at this stage. They're just not going to do that. And that's been bred into American allies by a long-standing American doctrine of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. And you know the reason for that. One of the reasons is not to provide Taiwan with a blanket security guarantee in order to discourage anyone within Taiwan from unilaterally proclaiming Taiwanese independence, 所谓台独, because if there's one sure way of undermining Taiwan's security, it will be for a unilateral declaration of Taiwanese independence, because that will automatically invite a Taiwanese mainland military action against Taiwan and may put in doubt, frankly, American and allied support for Taiwan, because Taiwan under those circumstances would be seen to have brung the problem down onto its own shoulders. And so people in the Minjindang need to be very careful about this question in particular. Taiwanese independence does not have a political constituency in the United States, in Europe, or anyone else. Maintaining the status quo for Taiwan does have a constituency in the US, in Europe, and in the rest of the democratic world. So I think that's important for us all to bear in mind. My last point is this. At the same time, in Taiwan, it would be very wise for our Taiwanese friends, whether they are in the Minjindang, the Kuomintang, or other Dangpai, is to look at ways in which they can recommence some form of political dialogue with Beijing, I understand all the problems, threshold problems with the 1992 consensus. I'm familiar with all of that. But you know something? It's very important for there to be a political line of communication between Taipei and Beijing. And at present, there is none, which means that when things go wrong, it automatically reverts back to the US-China military relationship. And that's destabilizing for everybody.
Well, one of the things a lot of people are saying is, we lack, especially in the West, leaders who truly understand both the dynamics in China as well as in the United States. So you are one of the very rare kind. Will you ever consider returning to politics and get involved?
No, it's way beyond my my level of interest in personal.
Too humble.
No, I'm not. 我从来没有当做任何谦虚的一个人。I've never been humble, but there's a limit to the amount of pain you can suffer in one life, and politics is full of pain. No, my role as head of an independent think tank in the United States, with representation in Washington, throughout the United States, but also in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, Australia, India, and now Europe. I just opened our Paris Center the other day, is to try and use our own channels, our own 非正式的渠道, 实时协调, because the thing which animates me is I do not want to see a war over Taiwan. I want there to be peace, first and foremost, for the people of Taiwan, because there is no such thing as a limited war over Taiwan. It would escalate rapidly into a total war with hundreds of thousands of people dead. And that is not my idea of a good future. Secondly, a war between the United States and China over Taiwan would be disastrous for China itself. In fact, it's equally possible that China would lose as well as possibly prevail or win militarily. And thirdly, such a war would be disastrous to the United States because we don't know whether the outcome would be to win or lose as well. It would collapse the entire global economy into a depression because you'd have the world's two largest economies at war with each other. We haven't seen that for hundreds of years in world history. And therefore, for those reasons, every one of our efforts should be directed towards a practical, pragmatic way through. And as I said, that's what I'm dedicated to. Far better I do that as a 非正式的人物，那个智库方面的那个人物，那个起小小的作用，来实时帮忙各方面协调，保护和平，保护经济发展，保护世界。
Well, I do think you're too humble because where you sit right now may actually have a greater impact, beyond sort of running in the political office. And thank you for speaking to TVBS today. We hope you can visit Taiwan again soon. The book, 可避免的战争，美国与习近平治理下的中国 is available online and in bookstores throughout Taiwan, or you can actually get an English and a Chinese copy like I do. So thank you, Kevin, and take good care.
Thanks so much for having me on the program, and all my best to all my friends in Taiwan, and there are many of them.
Thank you. All right.